Before we step into tonight's tale, I want you to do something for me. Look around the room you're in right now. Is it dim, lit only by the glow of your screen? Or is the light of the outside world still pushing through your curtains? Tell me, what time is it where you are? Midnight, when the walls feel closer and every sound seems sharper? Or dawn, when the silence feels like it's holding its breath? Share it below, because I want to know how the shadows reach you. Stories like this one are not meant for daylight. They come alive only when the world is still, when the hum of the city has died, when the night seems to lean in and listen. Tonight's story belongs to that silence. It belongs to the hour when old names rise again, names that once ruled cities with fear, men whose voices are long gone, but whose footsteps still echo if you know when to listen. Chapter 1. The Making of the Enforcer. Frank Nitti was not born with a gun in his hand, or a fedora on his head, but you would hardly know it from the way his story unfolded, a story dripping with shadow and violence, as if fate itself had carved his path in blood, long before his first breath. Born Francesco Raffaele Nitto in 1881, in the rugged hills of Salerno, Italy, he was just another immigrant child when his family crossed the Atlantic and settled into the crowded Italian slums of Brooklyn. Those slums were no place for innocence. They were alleys where disease spread faster than bread could rise, where children worked in sweatshops at 10 years old, and where poverty gnawed at families like a rat in the walls. By the time Nitti was a teenager, he had already understood a terrible truth. In America, men like him were not invited into the banquet of success. They were expected to serve it, to clean it, to die at the doors of it. And Nitti, restless, ambitious, quietly ruthless, refused to play the role of servant. He was short, barely 5'5", but in his eyes there was the cold gleam of someone who already believed the world owed him its knees. The streets of Brooklyn taught him speed and silence. He apprenticed as a barber for a time, his nimble hands cutting hair, trimming beards, but always learning the art of the razor, the flick of steel against skin. But the barber shop was only camouflage. Beneath it, Nitti built himself into a hustler, smuggling liquor before Prohibition even became law, running small-time extortion rackets, and learning how to make money multiply through gambling dens that lived in the back rooms of tenements. He was not flamboyant, not loud, not like the neighborhood braggarts who boasted of their crimes and ended up face down in gutters. Nitti's genius was patience. He knew when to strike, and more importantly, when to wait. Men said his silence was heavier than other men's words, that a room grew tense when his eyes settled on you. This silence made him dangerous, long before the gun ever did. By the 1920s, America was convulsing under the weight of Prohibition. Overnight, the country's thirst turned into a black market worth billions in today's money. To law-abiding men, it was a disaster. To Nitti, it was a revolution. He moved to Chicago and linked up with men whose names would become carved into legend: Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, and the sprawling empire of the Chicago outfit. This was not a ragtag street gang. This was an industrial-scale syndicate with accountants, enforcers, politicians on payroll, and judges who looked the other way. Nitti slid into this world like he had always belonged, his sharp suits and quiet smile concealing a mind that was already calculating percentages, routes, and profits. He quickly became Capone's trusted lieutenant, the one man Capone would later call the enforcer. Though Nitti himself rarely raised his voice, let alone his fist, that was his paradox. He was not the man who sprayed bullets across crowded restaurants. That was for the younger soldiers. He was the man who made sure those bullets meant something, who made sure the right men bled and the right men paid. Yet beneath the cold efficiency, there was something spectral about Nitti, something that unsettled even his fellow gangsters. He was meticulous, obsessed with detail. His books were cleaner than any accountant's, his orders delivered with the calm precision of a surgeon. But his punishments, when betrayal surfaced, were biblical in their severity. Some whispered he had learned special tortures back in Italy, ways of making a man disappear so thoroughly that even the earth seemed to deny him. His name began to circulate in hushed tones, not just in Chicago, but across the Midwest. Politicians feared him. Police courted him, and rival gangsters learned to dread the moment when a quiet knock might come at midnight, announcing the enforcer had come calling. And yet Frank Nitti walked through it all like a ghost, never hurried, never raising his voice, never leaving more than a faint footprint on the sand of history. It was this strange mixture of invisibility and inevitability that made him terrifying. Because in Chicago, it was said, nothing moved, not a bottle of whiskey, not a truck of guns, not a shipment of heroin, unless Nitti gave the nod. And he rarely nodded unless it made him richer, colder, and more untouchable than before. Chapter 2. The Empire of Shadows. By the early 1930s, Al Capone was crumbling beneath the weight of indictments, tax charges, and relentless federal pressure. The King of Chicago was being stripped of his crown, and in the shadows, Frank Nitti was already moving to inherit the throne. Not through violence or flashy coups, but through quiet calculation, as though he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. When Capone was finally sent to Alcatraz in 1931, suffering from syphilis that was rotting his brain, it was Nitti who stepped into the vacuum, not as a pretender, but as the chosen steward. He did not need the limelight. Capone had taught him well that too much attention only brought heat. Instead, Nitti built the outfit into something more terrifying than Capone's empire, an invisible government that stretched its fingers into every corner of Chicago life. Nitti's true genius was diversification. Where Capone had reveled in bootlegging and gambling, Nitti saw opportunity in every industry that could be bent, bought, or broken. He infiltrated labor unions with surgical precision, bribing officials, threatening holdouts, and installing loyal men who answered only to him. The Teamsters, the construction trades, even Hollywood unions felt his shadow. Yes, Hollywood. Few today realize that it was Frank Nitti who engineered the outfit's extortion racket in California, shaking down the movie studios of the 1930s and 40s, siphoning millions in protection money from men like Louis B. Mayer of MGM and Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures. Imagine that, the very films that filled America's theaters, that shaped its culture and dreams, were in part underwritten by the quiet nod of Frank Nitti, who sat back in Chicago counting the profits while actors and directors in Los Angeles unknowingly played on a stage he controlled. This reach, this audacity, is what made Nitti more than a gangster. He was an institution. His outfit controlled gambling dens in Cicero, speakeasies in downtown Chicago, dog tracks in Florida, casinos in Havana, and extortion rackets in Hollywood. His accountants kept ledgers so precise that historians today still marvel at the efficiency of his operation. He built what economists call a shadow monopoly, an underground empire so sprawling that even the federal government struggled to grasp its scale. By some estimates, the Chicago outfit under Nitti was generating the equivalent of $2 billion a year in today's dollars. A staggering fortune built on illegal whiskey, heroin shipments, rigged labor contracts, and extortion schemes that reached from Chicago to Los Angeles. But with this power came paranoia. Nitti was no fool. He knew the government wanted him as badly as it had wanted Capone. He lived behind fortress walls, moving from safe house to safe house, sleeping in different beds, surrounded by layers of loyal guards. He trusted few men and fewer women, even among his closest associates. Whispers grew that Nitti's calm demeanor masked a growing obsession with death. He was a chain smoker, often seen with a cigarette trembling slightly in his fingers as he reviewed ledgers late into the night, his eyes sunken, his frame gaunt. Some said he suffered nightmares, that he woke drenched in sweat, convinced the feds were breaking down his door. Others claimed he spoke of death almost casually, as if rehearsing for it, as if he already knew the ending of his own story. And indeed, Nitti's end would be unlike any other mob boss of his era. Shocking, tragic, and eerie in the way it seemed less like defeat and more like destiny fulfilled. But before that final night in 1943, Frank Nitti ruled Chicago with an iron grip. A man who did not need to shout, who did not need to strut. He was the quiet ruler of an empire of shadows, and every whisper of his name carried the weight of fear. Chapter 3. The Last Walk of Frank Nitti. On March 19th, 1943, Chicago awoke to headlines that felt more like a Greek tragedy than a newspaper report. Frank Nitti, the enforcer, was dead. But to understand the weight of that moment, you must first imagine the days leading up to it. Nitti was no longer the calm, unshakable presence he had once been. The federal government had indicted him, and several outfit leaders, in a case involving Hollywood extortion, a racket that had siphoned millions from the dream factories of Los Angeles. Unlike his predecessors, Nitti was not facing tax charges or petty violations. This was the kind of indictment that carried real prison time, and for Nitti, prison was not an option. He was claustrophobic, deeply so. A condition whispered about even by his closest allies. Rumors swirled that in childhood he had once been locked in a cellar for hours and emerged trembling, unable to breathe. To him, the thought of a cell was worse than death itself. He had told confidants more than once, "I'll never rot behind walls. They'll bury me first." As the trial loomed, his paranoia intensified. Witnesses recalled that he no longer trusted even his most loyal lieutenants. He paced constantly, smoking until his fingers yellowed, chain-drinking coffee, staring out windows as if expecting every car to stop, every footstep to signal doom. The outfit itself was restless. Many soldiers whispered that Nitti was no longer fit to lead, that perhaps his suicide was not merely chosen, but encouraged. On the morning of March 19th, he dressed deliberately, as though preparing for an appointment no one else could see. He put on a crisp gray suit, a fedora, polished shoes, and slipped a .32 caliber revolver into his pocket. Then, without ceremony, he left his riverside home and walked toward the Illinois Central Railroad tracks. It was 9 a.m., broad daylight, the world around him buzzing with ordinary life. Children walked to school, commuters waited at street corners, and there was Frank Nitti, one of the most feared men in America, walking alone, heading toward death with the calm of a man going to the barber. Near the viaduct, he stopped. Witnesses later said he looked strangely serene, almost relieved. He pulled the revolver and fired once into his head. The bullet grazed him, staggering him but failing to kill. He stumbled, firing again, hitting his jaw, teeth shattering, blood pouring, but still alive. The third shot finally ended him, the enforcer collapsing into the dirt beside the tracks, as the morning sun glared coldly overhead. His death was gruesome, awkward, unclean, the opposite of the precise control he had demanded in life. Yet in that horror, there was a strange kind of poetry. Frank Nitti, the man who built an empire on silence and inevitability, had chosen to silence himself, ensuring he would never be dragged before a judge, never caged, never humiliated by the very system he had outwitted for decades. And so, in the end, he kept his vow. He would not rot in a cell. But whether his hand was the only one on that gun remains, to this day, a question without an answer. Chapter 4. The Shadow After Death. For most gangsters, death ends the story. But with Frank Nitti, death seemed to birth an even darker legacy. Almost immediately, conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds. Some claimed Nitti's suicide was staged, that he had been murdered by his own men, who feared his indictment would drag the outfit down with him. After all, wasn't it strange that a man so meticulous, so calculating, would walk into the open and botch his first 2 shots, suffering horribly before the final bullet took him? Others whispered that the outfit had forced his hand, that the Hollywood racket had drawn too much attention, and the only way to contain the damage was to sacrifice Nitti. Even FBI agents at the time speculated whether the suicide was too convenient, too perfectly aligned with the outfit's interests. His death, rather than closing the case, widened it, leaving behind a trail of paranoia and unanswered questions. And then there were the more chilling stories, the whispers that refused to die. Residents near the riverside tracks swore that for years after his death, they would sometimes see a figure in a gray suit standing by the viaduct at dawn, smoke curling from a phantom cigarette. Railroad workers spoke of hearing footsteps on gravel when no one was there, of finding fresh cigarette butts near the spot where Nitti had died, as if someone or something kept returning. Mobsters themselves carried their own ghosts. Some said they dreamed of him, his jaw shattered, his face bloody, walking toward them in silence. Others swore that deals would collapse unexpectedly whenever Nitti's name was spoken too loudly, as if invoking him still carried a curse. In the underworld, his legend morphed into something spectral. Frank Nitti was not just dead, he was watching. But beyond the ghost stories, Nitti's death had real consequences. His empire did not collapse. It adapted. Under Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo, the Chicago outfit evolved into an even more efficient machine, tightening its grip on unions, gambling, and politics. The outfit outlasted nearly every other mafia syndicate in America, and some historians argue it was precisely because of Nitti's sacrifice. By taking the fall, by removing himself, he allowed the outfit to survive the storm. In a grim way, his death was not a defeat, but a final act of service to the empire he had built. And so, his shadow lingered, not just in the streets of Chicago, but in the very fabric of organized crime in America. Chapter 5. The Curse of the Enforcer. Even now, decades later, the name Frank Nitti carries an unease, as though speaking it risks inviting something cold and unseen. Scholars of organized crime point out that Nitti was unique. Unlike Capone, he never reveled in spectacle. Unlike Gotti, he never sought headlines. Unlike Luciano, he never dreamed of global syndicates. Nitti's gift, and his terror, was his simplicity. He made crime into business, stripping away the glamour, the theatrics, the cigars and champagne, until all that remained was profit and control. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy far more unsettling. The idea that crime, at its purest, is invisible. That the most dangerous men are not those you see strutting in nightclubs, but the quiet ones, the ones who never raise their voices, who let silence do the killing. But with that invisibility came a curse. For all his wealth, his influence, his power, Nitti died alone, stumbling through dirt, jaw shattered, blood pouring, watched by strangers instead of allies. His fortune dissolved into the outfit's treasury, his name buried beneath Capone's in the annals of crime, his life reduced to a cautionary whisper. Some say this was the true curse of Frank Nitti, that he built an empire vast enough to swallow Hollywood and Chicago alike, and yet he himself became a ghost story, forgotten by most, remembered only by the fearful few who know the shadows still whisper his name. And perhaps, late at night, when the city is quiet and the streets belong to memory, you may feel it, the enforcer's gaze. Perhaps you'll hear a faint crack of gravel behind you, or catch the scent of a cigarette you didn't light. Perhaps you'll sense that someone, somewhere, is still counting the debts of the living and the dead. For Frank Nitti may be gone, but the curse of silence he carried still coils through history. And like all true gangsters, he teaches us the most terrifying lesson of all, that death is not always an ending. Sometimes it is only the beginning of the whisper. And so, the story of Frank Nitti ends not with the roar of Tommy guns in a Chicago alley, nor with the glamour of a mob boss dining in a velvet-lined booth, but with the lonely crack of a revolver on a railroad embankment. A man who once ruled an empire, stretching from Cicero speakeasies to the studios of Hollywood, died face down in the dirt, his body small against the enormity of the tracks, his blood mingling with gravel that still rattled beneath passing trains. That is the paradox of Nitti, a man who bent labor unions, bribed senators, and siphoned millions from America's golden dreams, yet whose death was as raw and solitary as any forgotten drifter. For all the power he amassed, for all the whispers of fear that his name once summoned, in the end he died alone. No entourage, no bodyguards, no priest to absolve him, only the indifferent morning sun and the stares of strangers who happened upon the fall of an empire, distilled into one broken man. And yet, silence does not erase him. His shadow coils still in the archives of history, in the rumors that refuse to die, in the ghost stories told by railroad workers who swear that sometimes, in the early hours, They see a small man in a gray suit standing by the viaduct, smoke drifting from a cigarette that burns without a hand. Nitti lingers, not because of what he said. He was never a man of words, but because of what he represented. The quiet, patient predator. The businessman who turned crime into something systemic, who proved that organized crime was not chaos, but structure, bureaucracy, and cold mathematics. His death may have ended the man, but it did not end the model he perfected. Even now, pieces of the outfit's machinery still tick quietly in Chicago's veins. The legacy of the enforcer humming on in boardrooms and backrooms alike. And now, as the night deepens around you, let that whisper of Nitti's life settle into your own quiet. Let the roar of the trains fade into a hum. Let the shadow of the enforcer drift back into the darkness where he belonged. Tonight, you sleep not in Chicago of 1943, but in your own bed, safe, far removed from the streets where blood and whispers once ruled. Close your eyes knowing that even the most feared men of history, those who built empires on fear, silence, and profit, cannot outlive time. The trains move on, the gravel cools, the blood dries. And in the end, what remains is not the man, but the silence he left behind. Rest now. With that silence, let it carry you into dreams, where the shadows are only shadows, and the whispers fade into nothing. For Frank Nitti is gone, and the night belongs to you.